Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. You might be aware that one of Trump's first acts as president of the United States was to freeze USAID, aka the United States Agency for International Development. But this freeze is only one small part of the story. It revealed a much wider network of people and companies deriving a lot of profit from the DEI industry. That's diversity, equity, inclusion, for those not in the know. One whistleblower that has come to our attention is a young man called Nathan Halberstadt. He's formerly of the Boston Consulting Group and wrote a piece in the American Conservative about his time there and what it revealed to him. He joins me to talk about it. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start very simply. What is a consultant? It sounds like a simple question, but it actually might be more complex than we think. And what is the Boston Consulting Group and what exactly do they do?
I'll start with what BCG is, and then I'll talk a little bit about my own experience with it. So BCG stands for Boston Consulting Group. It's one of the big three management consulting firms, so alongside Bain and McKinsey. These three firms, they do professional services work for major American corporations, also NGOs and government organizations. So they have tens of billions of revenue collectively, and they essentially do knowledge work on behalf of major institutions.
Okay, I'll have to stop you there just for a second because it already sounds kind of fishy. I mean, I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but I've sat next to many a management consultant at dinners, and if you press them on exactly what they do, you will find phrases like knowledge work will come up a lot. What does that actually mean? What's the day-to-day life of a management consultant?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do is build slide decks on corporate strategy for our clients. So for example, if a mega corporation is looking to develop a 3-year strategy in a business area or maybe do an acquisition, they will hire Boston Consulting Group in order to do the analysis on whether or not to do a certain acquisition or which sort of path to go down for the corporation. And of course, where my piece actually sort of connects with this is that some of the work that BCG, McKinsey, and Bain started to do was ESG or DEI related. And they also tended to, or at least in more recent years, began to do work in the migration area and also sort of famously McKinsey in opioid sales. And so while they work with most major institutions in the United States, there's sort of a mixed track record in terms of the sorts of things that they worked on. The issue with these management consulting firms is that you're outsourcing decision-making to non-owner optimizers who are also non-employees. And so these people who are ultimately making the decisions have no skin in the game. They face no consequences if things go wrong. And further, they're totally insulated from democratic or even populist forces. So nobody gets to vote on McKinsey, right? And further, if McKinsey's project or Boston Consulting's project goes south, there are usually very few repercussions. At worst, sort of the contract isn't renewed into the next year. I joined Boston Consulting Group right out of college. I went to Vanderbilt University. I studied history and neuroscience. And I was recruited for an associate position. And as soon as I graduated from college, I went out to a training on my start date in Atlanta. And ultimately, what they usually do with new hires is you do around a week-long training, and then you get staffed on your first project. So in that first week-long training, you basically have this set of sort of very well-dressed, polished individuals who are essentially sort of reciting the party line at New York Times, sort of around the dinner table. It was extremely conformist behavior and also sort of uniformly left-wing or corporatist and sort of neoliberal talking points in general. So very socially liberal, but sort of economically free market talking points. And there was essentially no deviation from those. And so, we had basically people talking about their vision for basically decarbonizing the economy and that being something that they were passionate about doing at BCG. As soon as I finished that 1 week of training, my first case that I was staffed on was basically facilitating mass migration.
Let me just pause there for a second because I need to push back a little because we've all been in situations where we are in a room with other people that we want to leave a good impression with. Perhaps they can offer us a job, they can offer us some sort of leg up. And so what you want to do there is to give the best possible impression of yourself. You want to show yourself to be a considerate, intelligent, thoughtful person. So these are ways you can do that. You can kind of signal the idea that you care about the world around you. You want to decarbonize, you want to improve diversity in the workplace. These are all kind of buzzwords of things that at the time when you were there would have been considered virtuous in the world of business. Did you go along with them? You talk about conformity, and I hate to put you on the spot here, but were you also conforming to this idea?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's a part of the problem is ultimately that these sorts of behaviors were viewed as virtuous. and not just virtuous, but also ultimately necessary. And what we've seen over the past decade is that nonconformity with these standards actually gets you fired, right? Obviously, there's the famous story in 2017 where Google fired an employee, James Damore, who wrote the memo that was quite controversial, sort of standing against some of the themes that we see in the DEI space. If I had published this piece and was not working at a place like New Founding, where I am, which is a right-wing venture firm, I would be fired most likely. These sorts of contrarian perspectives are obviously not welcome, or historically have not been welcome in management consulting firms. Ultimately, you are given economic opportunity and social approval if you take a certain stance on ESG or DEI. So it's not just value rational to basically parrot that line. It's also instrumentally rational. You actually will get a better exit opportunity the louder you are about decarbonization or about equity initiatives.
Tell me about your first project, because this is the natural next step, I think, is you've gone through this process of meeting your future colleagues. They all seem to be treading the party line very carefully and mouthing all of the right words. And then you get onto this first project. And tell me a little more about that and what struck you about it when you first arrived.
Ultimately, I was on a team of around 5 individuals. We were working with a client who was optimizing migration contracts with the NGOs who basically provide free services to migrants in the United States. We did a number of different things for the organization. Some of it had to do with those contracts themselves, others with workforce, others with just a multi-year strategy and vision for the client. So as strategy consultants, that's often what we do for them. We did a 6-month contract with them. BCG and these other firms have done a large number of migration-related contracts. And out of actually the office that I was a part of, they publicly advertised their partnership with USAID, which is of course quite topical given the work that DOGE has been doing, basically gutting USAID for what is effectively fraud.
McKinsey, who is a similar consultancy, was brought into kind of hot water recently for associating with ICE, who do border patrol work in the US. Why is that? Is that an entirely kind of political thing that people decided that was on the quote wrong side of history, or is there something more complicated going on there? It seems that BCG has made such an effort here to stay on the right side, so to speak, on this question and to not face the same backlash that McKinsey faced. People
talk about the vibe shift, and amid this vibe shift, I think people are going to have less issue with a McKinsey working with ICE. Sort of in retrospect, actually, if you had to decide to work on behalf of the mass migration NGOs or ICE, it's probably going to be more popular over the next decade to have partnered with ICE. And so, that pressure that McKinsey felt was a little bit of left-wing activist pressure a few years back for some work that was also quite a few years back in the previous Trump administration. And so I expect the pressure to come from the other side this time around. I think that the American people sort of voted decisively in favor of securing the border, and also sort of against this apparatus of what is effectively a left-wing patronage system in America that sends dollars to especially young left-wing activists to bring migrants into America. So I think BCG probably took the wrong side of this, actually, and McKinsey may actually not have any more issues with any partnerships with ICE. That said, I think neither of these firms should be. I think they have a terrible track record, and they represent sort of the interests of the professional managerial class. And I don't think the government should be partnering with BCG, McKinsey, or Bain. Most people might not actually know that there are these consultants who kind of hover in the backdrop of these NGOs and government organizations. You expect these jobs to be done by civil servants, people who are trained and also highly knowledgeable about their area of interest. But you might be able to enlighten me on this. Why is it that you, for example, a graduate who has no very particular interest in immigration law, ends up in a room advising an NGO on their immigration policy? How does that actually happen? Why is it that, to avoid offense here, I'll say you seem like a very smart young man, but why is it that you, a young graduate, is left with this sort of responsibility and it's not being taken on by the actual employees of these NGOs or government officials? What's happened there to lead to this point? It's a great question. I am not a migration expert, so it is the right question. To maybe zoom out a little bit, I was a history major at Vanderbilt, and actually one sort of relevant point is actually the interplay between the universities and the professional managerial class as it sort of now exists with the consulting firms. So in the pre-war period, before World War II, so even all the way back to the 18th century, university students were primarily the children of industrialists or sort of the landed aristocracy. There would be a small number of what they called grinds. It was actually sort of a slur against them, almost more of the Alexander Hamilton type of archetype. Somebody who came from a lower class background, was very bright, and then maybe went to law school. And those kids were a very small percentage of the university population. They usually were directed towards the church, towards medicine, or towards law. What happened after World War II with the GI Bill, at least in America, is that we have the rise of mass college education, and specifically sort of the rise of the lecture hall. The large lecture hall comes around for the first time, and students who come from sort of lower or middle class backgrounds begin being trained for manager-type positions in American mega corporations. So if you graduated in 1955 from sort of a big state school, you would get a job at Coca-Cola or at Dow Chemical or DuPont, and it would be sort of a manager-type role at the plant or in the corporate headquarters. Now, that shift is interesting because you basically go from educating the owners or the people who would inherit ownership to educating people who are then sort of in this non-owner optimizer managerial position. That has actually further evolved. So students who graduate today, I'm thinking about the class, I graduated class of 2022 at Vanderbilt. I don't know anybody really who went to go work for a major American sort of producing corporation. Pretty much all went to service industries, right? So they went to investment banking or into the consulting industry, consulting industry being by far the most common pathway. What really has occurred here is that the mega corporations no longer hire the college students for the most part for their service industry work. The consulting firms hire us, and then we work then back over to Coca-Cola. So BCG will basically do a contract for Coca-Cola. So the shift is basically from educating owners to educating managers who are employees to now you're basically educating and placing these kids who are non-owner optimizers, but also non-employees. And so again, they have no skin in the game. And that is a problem for us as a society, that basically we have tens of thousands of ostensibly bright kids who are doing things where they are non-experts in the issue. And also if it goes south, they don't suffer any consequences for it, or the firm doesn't even really.
What sort of companies is this creating? Because what we've found is that there almost seems to be a zombie culture at the center of government and what used to be these quite dynamic corporations that were producing at home. And the vultures surrounding them are these consultants and venture capitalists who actually don't have any stake in the survival or death of that industry or institution. How do we kind of get beyond this?
Yeah, so I think we need a return to agency, and especially agency replacing process. So consultants will come in to a mega corporation or even a government agency and really take power away from individuals and put in place 100 different parallel processes. And they sort of act in parallel and lead to these questionable or irrational or stagnant outcomes that we experience. And so I think by returning to almost a little bit more of the Silicon Valley entrepreneurial type of system where you have an owner founder, this is actually where a lot of, I think, the innovation and productivity and sort of the energy in America is right now. We obviously see it right now in the Gundao, the hard tech scene. We need to return to agency and trusting human judgment instead of process. I think one other is ownership. You get worse outcomes if you have a technocratic non-owner optimizer making the decisions, because ultimately they have no skin in the game. And maybe they should care about the outcome. But if it doesn't impact them, will they care?
It would seem quite fundamental to a good running of business and government that people actually care about whether it works or not.
Well, yes. I think about my time at BCG. On none of the contracts that I worked on did the actual outcome matter to me or my career. There was no impact. And so, and actually, this is where the left-wing activism can become particularly problematic. It becomes beneficial for me to parrot and push for very left-wing views and, let's say, our strategy recommendations. I will receive economic opportunity and social approval for doing that. But I don't suffer any of the consequences that are experienced by the firm then implementing those.
This is quite hard to get your head around, though, if you're just used to working in traditional businesses or an industry like my own industry in journalism, where, of course, your outcomes are what you're judged upon. How can it be that someone like you at this consultancy can impose a kind of, let's say, DEI measure on another company, which then results in worse outcomes, but then step away and say that's still a success on my end? How is that even possible? And how has this been functioning like that for so long?
And I think what we're seeing is that the professional managerial class has their own interests. And sort of as a block, this global group of professional managers, they act in their own interest and they have their own set of values and their own sort of set of ways of grading individuals. So when I was at BCG, we have basically this internal grading matrix that your promotion or also your bonus decisions are made based on. And there's no category there that's based on how your client did or what the effect of those DEI measures actually was, right? They were grading us on our verbal comms or on our ability to do a specific model a certain way. And so I think at the highest level, the partners in these firms have their own interests that are at odds with often the interests of the firms they serve, but also at odds with the American people and our values and way of life. I think that they have sort of diverged in what they are after, and they are obviously incredibly powerful. I would say we're sort of fundamentally ruled by the professional managerial class, or at least have been for the last decade. I think the Trump administration is doing work to roll that back. But of course, they're extremely entrenched and powerful, as you see by the fact that they still have $1 billion of contracts with just the federal government, and of course, many more with the NGOs and in the private sector.
I just want to read something from your piece because I thought it was quite interesting, and we'll return then to the question of the immigration project that you were doing, because you mentioned in your piece that BCG is conducting this particular set of immigration investigations and then advice giving to different NGOs and corporations in parallel, as you say, with private sector projects intended to help global business leaders capitalize on migrant labor. So there is a two-part strategy almost going on at BCG, wherein migration and migration-based projects can be used to boost a kind of virtue signaling, as you've mentioned before, on the DEI side. We do good things for migrants. We are an internationalist company with a global worldview. And then on the other side, they can benefit from the fact that they're bringing in cheap labor into America and then pairing it up with their other companies that they are working with. Is that a kind of fair assessment of what you're saying there?
Yes. There's definitely a conflict of interest here at a minimum. You basically see across the consulting industry playing both sides of the street. You see consulting firms consulting for Raytheon and defense at the same time. You see them consulting for Pfizer and FDA at the same time. You see them consulting for the mass migration NGOs and the federal government immigration arms at the same time. Oftentimes, they do a good job of basically putting different partners in charge of those different lines of work, but often still within the same firm. Of course, there have been a few scandals around this where they were not as careful about staying as separate as possible. But even if it's different people executing the work, they share the same incentives and they're a part of the same professional managerial class. And this is actually a part of the argument for why the federal government should cut all of its contracts with these firms. It's actually not okay that the FDA has contracts with a consulting firm that is also working with Johnson & Johnson. I think that is deeply ethically problematic.
But in a way, they can both escape scrutiny by having it from this outside source. Because the advice is coming from BCG or Bain or McKinsey, there is a certain amount of being able to stand back and put your hands up and say, look, we didn't know that they were also working with Johnson & Johnson or whoever. The kind of idea of due diligence is slightly let go at that point because it becomes so diffuse. And if they're working with literally everyone, then it's very hard to kind of trace back or follow the money.
Absolutely. Yes. And they generally do their best to keep their clients private for this reason, of course.
It's not just BCG going into other companies and imposing a kind of DEI scale of value onto their business. It's also within BCG itself. So tell me more about how that kind of DEI perspective worked in the company while you were in it.
Yeah, maybe to start with the global piece. So all of these firms, or at least the big three, I should say, Bain, McKinsey, and BCG, they are global partnerships, which means that it is a voting group of partners who, are sort of distributed across the globe. So at any given time, the number of voting members who are based in the U.S. or Canada or Europe or China, India, Saudi Arabia is sort of constantly in flux. And it's not necessarily the case that U.S. partners are always in the majority, which means that you are basically subject to the global interests of this, again, quite wealthy professional managerial elite. The direction of the company is not necessarily steered by an American or patriotic nationalist or anything like that. Obviously, currently at BCG, the CEO is a German. DEI, I describe it as a sacralized managerialism. Ultimately, managerialism is extremely soulless. Like if you're up at 11 p.m. In an Excel model in sort of under flickering lights in an office building, right? This is not an inspiring way to live a life. And the sorts of things that we work on also, right? Oftentimes working on optimizing some sort of workforce thing where sort of the outcomes in society are sort of questionable at best. And so there's this real need basically to create some sort of end for all of this. Like, what are we even here for? These people need a purpose to live for. And ultimately, I think DEI, and to some extent ESG, is the mechanism that that has emerged. I don't even know if they selected it consciously, right? It has its own eschatology, it has its own central sacrament, and it has its own liturgy, which you of course see the liturgy most obviously in the Pride Month and in all of the diversity days and the ways in which it's sort of taken over our calendar, and there's sort of this set of public readings and commitments that everybody has to participate in. And that's a part of also the sort of role playing, that in order to be promoted, you must role play along with the public liturgy that they have created.
Was this something that just came naturally? Was it just something people picked up from the ether? Or was there actual training or resources that guided people towards this conclusion?
I think activists really pressured companies like BCG in order to implement these policies. I think managerial bureaucracies are extremely vulnerable to left-wing activists. Ultimately, again, they're not sensitive to the outcomes, and so they are sensitive to negative press.
I mentioned USAID there in the introduction to this. Are you aware of how much of BCG's work is, or was, in fact, funded by USAID?
I'll just say we had partnerships with USAID. Mm-hmm.
What do you think the effect will be then of this freeze of USAID?
So any contracts that BCG had with USAID, I would assume, are now at least on pause. This should also impact some of the direction of BCG's work going forward, right? This sort of extreme left-wing, basically patronage consulting, it should hopefully now be viewed as risky and as very problematic to keep on at the firm. So, of course, yes, we have our partnerships with USAID, but that's just one of dozens of similar organizations that I would say are equally problematic that we have partnered with at BCG over the past decade. They are essentially just funding activism, or in many cases, we are taking money from the federal government in order to partner with activists. And historically, it helped us in recruiting to be able to go to Yale and tell kids that we had partnerships with these activist organizations. Sort of young kids who are passionate about working for change, they think it's great, or they thought it was great in 2017.
Mm-hmm. And also might make you feel a little bit better about just cravenly wanting to earn loads of money. If you think, which job is going to give me the best starter paycheck, consultancy is a great option, but then you of course need the other side, which is how can I explain this to my very virtuous friends who are going to become doctors and nurses and veterinarians? How do I possibly explain to them that I'm going to go and work for the evil BCG, McKinsey or Bain? Well, this is a great way of doing it. It's a very good PR stunt on their part.
Absolutely. It gives the undergraduate student moral credibility to move into this industry. And I would really say that what does BCG offer a college senior, right? First, it offers them money, more than, let's say, a humanities major would otherwise make in sort of comparable industries. And it also offers them a brand name that they can feel proud of, or that will help them in their career down the road. But then the third point would be exactly what you're getting at here. It gives them basically this opportunity for impact. All young progressives basically want to work for change. And they want to work for change on the DEI and ESG type areas. There are others as well, but those have been the primary areas. So these have been, quite advertised to young people as a reason to join BCG. The last piece is that BCG offers basically a rapid trajectory and an exit into another powerful managerial organization. So most people do not stay with BCG for their whole career, or McKinsey or Bain. They will generally do, let's say 1 to 5 years, and then exit into a place in the federal government or in an NGO or in a major corporation in sort of an enviable managerial role. So it's this sort of natural pipeline into the managerial class.
Do you think that there's going to be more scrutiny on those kinds of institutions now that the projects funded by USAID have been revealed to, in many cases, be quite frivolous or certainly not for the best interests of the American people? Is that going to be the beginning of a wider reckoning?
I think it's likely that these firms feel pressure and are going to need to continue to clamp down on this sort of left-wing activism that they've been doing over the past decade. I think we'll see places like BCG hopefully eliminate their DEI programs. That's ultimately one of the reasons why I wrote the piece. I wanted to inspire young people to choose to do something better with their life, and then also to inspire BCG to eliminate their DEI program. It'll hopefully, move beyond USAID and move beyond DEI as well. But these are good starting points where there's already a political consensus that these are extremely problematic.
Maybe I'm incredibly naive, but my impression of consultancy was that it was supposed to or ought to function a bit like what Elon Musk's DOGE is trying to do for the American government, aka coming in and overseeing what might be quite bloated institutional processes and saying, look, we can mix things up, we can shake up the system, and we can make things more efficient, more rational, more reasonable, and kind of more profitable for everybody. I thought that was the role of consultants. It's interesting that there has seemed to be a shift over time by which consultants have actually started to make institutions more bloated, more baggy, more slow to react.
I think it's obviously the case today that large management consulting firms largely optimize bureaucracy with more bureaucracy. So I have not seen a consulting project that looks like DOGE. So I think that where you still see that sort of dynamism is in Silicon Valley or in sort of the entrepreneurial or venture capital type of scene, where you have these people who are extremely high agency making these sorts of executive decisions. I see less of that at BCG. I'm not sure exactly when it shifted. Probably a piece of this is that the economy is just so much more complex today than, let's say, the earliest management consultants in sort of the mid 20th century, where you could make a strategy deck that was as simple as you should grow revenue and cut costs, and so that was not bureaucratic. But the way to basically make money now is taking agency away from employees in mega corporations and replacing it with a process, and that sometimes leads to temporary efficiency gains. But over the long run, it basically makes people's jobs quite meaningless and takes away their agency. And that's largely what I think consultants do today.
Do you think that the second coming of Trump might actually be the beginning of the end of this kind of consultancy economy? Is it that actually what we're witnessing with USAID and the beginning of this, what might be a domino effect, where DOGE starts to target these other organizations that you say are wasteful? Is this actually the beginning of the end of this managerial class? Are they facing the twilight of their era? Is this finally it for them?
James Burnham talks about the managerial revolution and basically the takeover of American institutions by the professional managerial class. And I think that is what has occurred. Now, I think we're obviously in the midst of a transition to the digital age. And AI is one technology that seems extremely likely to basically replace the technology of bureaucracy. So I'm quite optimistic that a combination of populist pressure and sort of the MAGA movement and Trump, some high agency individuals and AI will collectively eliminate the power of the professional managerial class. I think that we can do better than managerialism. I think that the professional managerial class has obviously failed, as the COVID era and many other recent catastrophes have shown. They have not been held accountable, and I think that reckoning is on its way right now.
Before I let you go, I just want to ask you one last thing, which is you are obviously very young. You're one of the youngest guests I think we've ever had on the channel. Tell me a bit about your generation of graduates. What is the mood amongst, what are you, Gen Z? I'm so old that I don't even know.
I am Gen Z.
You're Gen Z, okay. So tell me, what is the mood amongst Gen Z graduates? Where do you think this tide is headed? It feels certainly that it is more socially acceptable for somebody as young as you to now be interested in right-wing politics than it has ever been before.
So I think it's obviously the case that young men are shifting to the right and young women are largely staying sort of where they are, probably somewhat center-left on average. We also see, I think the New York Times ran a piece recently that young men are also returning to Christianity in larger numbers. And I think Gen Z largely just has a sense of dissatisfaction with the managerial system that we live under offers them. It's not very inspiring. I don't want to sit behind a laptop screen optimizing KPIs for the next 30 years. That sounds like a pretty soul-crushing way to live a life. And so I think that young people are hungry for alternatives. Some of those will be in politics. Some of those will be in entrepreneurship. Here at New Founding, we're really at the intersection of those, right? We're entrepreneurial, but also interested in political and civilizational questions. And we have just an incredible sort of audience of motivated young people who are inspired by these things. People are motivated to actually do things. I think will is in. I think that agency and taking risk, even like Elon did when backing Trump and purchasing X. These sorts of things inspire people. And so I think we're going to enter an era where risk is viewed more positively, and ambitious people will continue to basically advance alternative models to the managerial system that seems like it's collapsing right now.
Well, you've heard it here first, folks. Risk is in and conformity is out, at least according to Nathan. Thanks so much for coming on, Nathan.
Great. Thank you for having me.
So that was Nathan Halberstadt, author of a new piece in The American Conservative about his time at the Boston Consulting Group. Some interesting insider information there about the processes of imposing DEI on external companies, and in fact within the BCG itself, and also about how American money is used across the world to further certain political goals and objectives that we might not have known about before. Thanks for watching. This was UnHerd.